Increased from like a 2 to 3 week rotational period of the time that they spent in each paddock to now I'm about 7 to 10 days. And that fit really nicely with the calving on grass because I have the grass in these paddocks. These paddocks are growing more. They have a longer rest period, so I can bring these cows in there to calve. They have their calves. They're there about 7 to 10 days and they move on to the next paddock. And it gives them nice feed with the natural grasses. There's the cool seasons, and then as we get a little later into June, you get the warm season. Grass is starting to come. There's good cover for the calves. The pastures that I calve in, that's the only time those cows are in those pastures is during their calving time in May and June.
But when calving season comes, prior to them actually starting to calve, we start to go out on pastures that have basically been dormant, stockpiled for about 10 months from the previous season. So we have all the last year's growth is out there, and those pastures are only used for that particular time of the year. And so they aren't part of our regular rotation pastures. They are dedicated pastures for May and June calving.
Pastures that we calve in, that's the only time we use them. And so we don't care what they grow up into. If it's some weeds, grass, big blue stem, a lot of dead grass in there, that's fine. That's what we like to calve in. And you can't just calve on hilltops because, you know, those cold winds and whatever comes along, they're more exposed up there. So we like to have hills and then some valleys between them for protection and whatever else.
So we start calving about the 1st of May, and every winter I kind of pretend that the 1st of May I'm going to have nice lush green grass to calve into. That's not the reality. A lot of 1st of Mays, I've got some nice grass to calve into, but also quite a lot of Mays we still have snow and not real nice weather. What I end up doing is in March and April, I typically bale graze. So I'll be bale grazing out on former crop land that's planted back to grass. The cattle will be on grass, and I'll actually start calving while I'm bale grazing. As the grass starts growing, then I'll transition out of the bale grazing into alfalfa legume mixtures and some native pasture that's close by home there. So we'll end up moving the cows maybe every 3 to 5 days, maybe every 5 to 7 days, depending on how calving is going. And so typically we're calving out on grass, pretty decent kind of dry ground.
They've been a month now, their calves have been weaned off, and we want them to gain. You know, now we want them to rest, relax, take it easy, be a cow, and get ready to calve in May. And they've got, pretty quick, this was a 1,000-acre pasture. There are 300 cows. In about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, they will pick them up again and move them to another pasture, and there'll be 400 or 500 acre pastures that they'll go through before they calve. And then they'll go into another pasture, a fresh pasture, and start calving. So these cows are living the good life now. And we get a storm, they just walk under the cedar trees. We're blessed to have protection. And every time I see that, I think, yep, we're blessed to have protection.
So we're actually moving the cows prior to calving so we can calve out on green pasture. And what that allows us to do is once those cows get to that green pasture, they have a nice clean place to calve. They can have their own space and form that nice bond with the calf. And it really reduces stress on the cow, it reduces stress on the calf. It also allows us to get into our grazing system a little bit quicker because we can still move those cows every couple of days with those calves because they're just moving from, one side of a polywire to another side of a polywire. And those calves can either catch up or follow right along even if they're just a day or two old. And that allows us to meet our goals for the environment as that grass is growing very quickly. In early May, we want to be moving quickly to take advantage of that spring flush. And just with that quick movement, we're allowed to kind of get some bonus grazing because we're able to actually keep up with the grasses that we have on the operation. Okay. Some of the things we didn't think about enough when we were changing our calving date was where do we want our cows to be at when they drop those calves? We had originally thought about it just in terms of it's May now, we can have calves. But we didn't think about where those cows should be so that those calves can stay at their side because our operation is not all contiguous. So what we do is we defer a pasture so that it has plenty of leftover grass, plenty of stockpile, along with some new green grass. And that way when the cows first get out there, even if there's not enough new regrowth to support them, there's plenty of old grass and they just kind of mix them together as they're grazing. And they do really well on it, and it helps keep them full and keeps them from getting washy, and we don't really deal with grass tetany and some of those things you hear about if they're just eating that fresh green grass. So that also allows us to have a little bit of standing forage to provide some protection, because in May, it's not that uncommon for us to get some cold and wind. And by cold, we're talking, maybe 40 degrees versus, 0 earlier. But that wet can really be hard on a calf, so it still gives them a place to get out of the wind. So just that deferring and making sure that we do have some grass from the year before that is left just for the purpose of when we move them out to that summer pasture, they have that to start with. And I'm really only looking at needing about 2 weeks worth of forage right up front, because by the time I hit the 20th of May, I've got knee-high grass and quite a bit of the pasture, so I can easily start to move them into other places.
We do have some pastures that have good protection, no question about it. Hills, primarily, some pretty good draws that they can get into, and some trees, but for the most part, it's just draws that they can get into. But you don't have to concern yourself quite as much with protection from bad weather when you're calving in May. And so for the most part, we don't concern ourselves a lot with protection from blizzard type conditions. Good drainage is critical, and we've got that in just about every location where we calve.
We try not to graze in the same place at the same time of year on any of our ranch if we can. So we try to change the season of use. So we don't usually calve at the same place at the same time. But when you're calving out on grass, you don't really have to. You can move that around. And so one thing that we do is that if we know we're gonna calve, which takes management, figuring out where we're gonna be the next year to calve, then that area we don't want to graze, say after the 1st of June, and we'll let that stockpile grass the second half of the summer, and so that come spring, there's a lot of old forage there. There's new forage coming up in it. So it's an ideal place for cows to have the perfect nutrient requirements. Plus it's got the perfect place for a cow to have a calf. She has a lot of protection. She can go off by herself and lay down in the tall grass and have a calf. And it's just a really neat way to do it. I think is the best way to do it, for us at least. And that's another thing that we've found that people say, well, want to have a lot of fallout with cows with bad udders? And I'll say, well, yeah, you will, some. But the key there is management again. If you have old forage with green grass growing up in it, you're going to have a balanced diet that you'll have less fallout with bad udders.
An ideal calving situation for me would be doing my rotation on my warm season grasses, because we have a lot of brome grass. So I start out calving in my warm season pastures, which are not growing yet, and really hit my brome grass, my unwanted, well, I shouldn't say unwanted species, because I know a lot of people don't like brome grass. I do like brome grass. It's just another forage that you got to manage and use. And so I'm that's where I always start calving, is in my warm season grasses, my native grasses, to get my brome invaders out and use that. I call it free pasture, because then by July I can come back in there and have some really good warm season grasses. And so it's just like a double crop to me. I don't like having where there's a dam or a dugout. And I've had it happen that so it's a hot day, she's having problems. So what does she do? She goes stands in the dam and drowns the calf for you.
If you got good grass and you've taken care of it, the only time we put them in a certain pasture that we've always kind of got a pasture we leave alone. It's got grass in it. That grass is cool. It gives shade.
There was issues wherever we went, and there will always be some calving issues with cattle, but our calving problems, pulling calves went way down, almost non-existent. The health of our calves, we no longer have scours. We calve out in the pasture in a rotation. They're not on the same ground for more than 2 days at a time, so we're moving pretty fast to keep everything healthy. And it also helps keep the nutrition level up. And the calves are born in green grass and plenty of cover on the ground, so they're usually pretty warm out there in May, and don't have snowbanks to contend with. Not saying that we haven't had trouble in May. We have had, last year we had cold rain in May, and that kind of hurt our calving. We lost a few calves out of that. So, well, the ideal place to start calving is where I left a lot of grass from last year, and we can calve anywhere on our place. We don't have a specific spot. We might be 2 miles from any kind of corrals while we're calving, and we just keep moving them. But we want them calves to be able to lay down on cover. We want the ground covered. We don't want bare ground. And the cows don't want to be on totally green grass, because you can end up with some problems that way too. We want a mixture of new grass and old grass, and a place for the calves to lay. And taller the better, because that's a protection for them baby calves. They can lay down in a cold, wet rain, and they will be fine out in the pasture. So
I'm still really early into it. So what I envision is where my cows are going to calve, they're probably not going to calve in the same place every year because of my management style. I want to try to move and I want them to calve in well-rested ground, maybe even 365 days of rested, maybe even more. So I want them to calve in an area that's got plenty of grass, has had rest, and so that I have as least amount of worries about that on bare ground. Or a lot of guys had mentioned we have monsoons in May lately. Well, if you have a lot of grass and it's capturing a lot of that and soaking it in, it doesn't matter if you have a lot of low-lying areas, as long as your ground's catching most of that moisture and absorbing it, I don't think you have a lot of issues.
I knew I had to set up some pastures fairly close to my buildings that I didn't use the rest of the year, so I had good grass to calve on. That all worked out really, really well the first year, and I've done the same thing every year since. Pine needle abortion happens in the last trimester for some reason. It can happen earlier than that, but it does happen in the last trimester. So I had to have those cows out of the pine trees early. Now I can really run in the pine trees most of the winter. And if we get really deep snow and really cold, I kind of worry about it and pull them out. But yeah, the last trimester then is in March, April, so I can get through December, January, some of February running in the pine trees where I have cover, more cover for the cows, a little more protection. Yeah, the pine needle abortion deal is really ugly, and there's a lot of people west of me out in Wyoming have gone to calving in the fall just for that reason.
to get rid of running them pregnant in the pine trees.